Welcome back. My name is Jack Burgess. I model Yosemite Valley Railroad. This time I'm going to talk about weathering. And it's not how to weather. There are probably 1,000 videos on YouTube about how to do it. What I want to talk about is some research before you weather something. And I have some examples that I want to share and so forth. Note that I model August 1939, which is important to me when it comes to weathering. I'm looking for equipment. What would it look like in 1939? For a while I had a boxcar on the layout that was built in July 1939, so it would be brand new. But I eventually realized it was too new, it would not be on my railroad, and sold it on eBay. This photo was taken in 1945, and it shows a train in mixed train service. The photographer, who was Al Rose, is back on a combine at the very end of the train. But looking forward, you'll notice that those cars are very well taken care of. There is some fading of the paint and the lettering and so forth, but the very first car is a YV rock car or hopper car full of mine tailings, which will be used as ballast. The next car is a Northern Pacific, followed by a Great Northern, and then a YV car and a couple SP cars. And they all look in pretty good shape. Again, this is 1945, so 4 or 5 years after I'm modeling, but I got the feeling that the equipment was fairly well maintained in those days. Even though we're coming out of the Depression, that probably had an influence on it. But after the war started, things started going downhill because there was so much traffic that stuff was not being maintained that well. But again, this is actually the year that the war ended in the Pacific, is 1945. Here's another photo of the same train a little further down the line. But again, the paint looks a little weathered, but not a whole lot. Stuff is not so faded that you can't read the names on the cars and so forth. What I'd like to do is share some of the equipment on my layout so you can see the weathering and talk about that. So here we have a Santa Fe reefer. You'll notice it's just a little bit weathered, not that much. What I did is oversprayed the lettering just a little, and so that it looks fairly well maintained. Next to it is a Santa Fe boxcar, a little more weathering. You can see there's some dust along the bottom. I have lightened the decals somewhat, but again, not overly weathered. So here's another car. This is a PFE reefer. Tony Thompson, in his well-researched book on PFE, mentioned that PFE was painting their cars every 4 to 8 years. And starting in the 30s, they were washing cars. They would wash as many as 9,000 cars a year. So if you're modeling a PFE car, you don't want to over-weather it. It should look fairly clean because they took care of their stuff. So this is my example. There's a couple chalk marks, but otherwise, all I did was lighten. I didn't want it to look brand new, that it was painted 2 weeks ago, but it's not going to have a lot of weathering on it either. So this photo was taken in 1942 from the observation car. Shows the site at Emory, which was where they had a limestone operation, and a whole string of YV rock cars. And if you look at them, they're all relatively well maintained. There's no paint missing, little variations in color and so forth. So here's my model of one of those cars, and I try to replicate that same thing of fairly light weathering, well maintained. So here's a prototype photo of one of those rock cars. Again, it's fairly well maintained, even though this was 1944, after Yosemite Portland Cement was sold and the cars were no longer being used. So here's a prototype photo of one of the YV stock cars. They had 3 of these stock cars. They were very rarely used as far as I know. They may have been used in the early years before the Yosemite National Park allowed vehicles in the park. And so everybody went into the park by horse-drawn stage. And during the winter, they may have moved those horses down to pasture using YV stock cars. That's the only thing I can think of them using. But they were still very well maintained. And one of the reasons I think that the stuff was so well maintained is that during the winter months, the logging operation shut down. And so the crew on the logging train probably bumped the crew on the extras, because the extra crew was at the bottom of the line. And those guys bumped people that were in the shop, and the people that were in the shop bumped some other people. One reason I think of this as a possibility is that the general manager was a real people person. I've been told that if you were in jail and the sheriff came and said, well, I've got a guy in jail for being drunk in public, but he says he works for the railroad, and if he does, I'll let him go. And the manager said, oh yeah, he works for me. So the guy would be released and show up at the railroad. The guy says, well, take off. I got you out of jail, but I'm not going to give you a job. But I think he kept everybody on during the winter months maintaining the equipment. So there is no reason to keep these stock cars well painted. They're going to deteriorate, but they were cars that were built around the turn of the century. So I think that's why a lot of it was well maintained. And the people that worked there really took pride in their job and in the railroad. Here's a prototype photo of one of the YV cabooses. Again, very well maintained. And here's my scratch-built model of that caboose. That brings us to locomotives. The locomotives on the YV were also well maintained. I had a friend that passed away a decade ago and got a job as a wiper on the YV in 1942. And that's what he did, is he wiped down the engines, and he had a broken off saw blade that he would use to get grime out from grooves and so forth. So the engines looked nice. And again, they took pride in their equipment. So here's a prototype photo of one of the 440s the YV owned up at El Portel in passenger service. And you can see that it is really well maintained. It was wiped down. You can see the gloss on it. So here's one of my 440s up at El Portel with a short winter train. Again, fairly well maintained. Here's another photo of one of the 260s, number 25. And again, it is nice and shiny, and it was used in freight service. It was not used in passenger service that much. It might have been, but again, really wiped down. And so I actually painted a locomotive in this kind of condition, 30, 40 years ago, wrote an article about it, and it was exactly what the prototype was. The boiler was all gloss, the running gear was dull, but it just didn't work out. So I haven't done it to that degree since then. But here's my number 25. Again, it's not glossy, but it is clean. I don't have any photos that I can think of that shows dust along the drivers, for example. Their track was all ballasted, and I don't know where dust would have come from, but that's how I've done it, is maybe some dust back on the tender, but not on the engine itself. So now I want to talk about techniques I have used on some cars, not how to do it, but the results of using particular weathering methods. And I'm going to start with the Sioux-Line car. It's got chalk marks. I've got chalk marks from Clover House and some other places. Chalk marks were done by yard crews on bigger railroads to identify where a car was going to go. On the YV, they didn't use chalk marks as far as I know, and I know they never chalked up their own cars because the conductor would work up a switch list, and that would tell them exactly where things were supposed to go. This is the very last month, a couple of weeks before the last run, and a lot of stuff's being moved to the house track and so forth. But the conductor in the caboose would have all of his waybills, and he would take the information on the waybills, convert it to a switch list, and then the crew would walk around with a switch list in their pocket and go from there. So on this car, What I've done is I've added chalk marks along here, but I put them, some of them, I put on when I do the decals. Then when I overspray everything, the chalk marks also fade partially away. And then I might add one more clean one, and so you have kind of a timeline between the chalk marks. I've used Bragdon weathering powders for a lot of my cars. They work really well, they're easy to use, easy to control. This is a good example of a Dimmer rear Grand boxcar. I've used it to kind of show how maybe the paint faded a little bit or ran down. Not sure how accurate that would be, but it gives you an easy overall way to weather something and not get carried away. I also have a set of pan pastels. I don't use them that often. This car I did. It's okay, I'm not going to do it again, but I painted it and so forth, and then I used some red and streaked it down. Not sure what that's supposed to represent, but that's probably one reason I don't use them very much anymore. I just don't find them as easy to control as the Bragdon stuff. I've got this photo of a Fe Boxcar maybe 25, 30 years ago. It's a great photo of this particular car, and the weathering really struck me. You can see that under the door is kind of white, and so I had forgotten that I'd actually already built this car, but I was waiting for a kit from Westerfield to build it, and fortunately, before I did that, I decided to try to find out what caused the weathering and what year it was, because this particular photo I did not have a year on. Then a couple decades ago, a friend of mine was on eBay and bought this book for me, which answered the question ultimately. These were put out every month by the state of California Department of Natural Resources. And what they were information on all kinds of minerals. And this one had a section on all of the mines, quarries, and so forth in Merced County. I already had copies of pages from one of these same publications for Mariposa County. The YV started in Merced County and then ended up in Mariposa County. That book for Mariposa County is very rare because it talks about all of the gold mines. And what I was able to do is one of my projects was a project manager for the construction of a library, and I got to know the head librarian very well and asked her if she could get an interlibrary loan of the book on Mariposa County, which she did. And once you get it, you can only read it in the library. You cannot take it home. You can't do anything else. You check it out, look at it, read it, whatever, make notes, and give it back to the librarian. Well, she trusted me, and I borrowed it for an hour and copied probably 50 pages of that one. This one had an article on, like I mentioned, on all the stuff in Merced County, including the Yosemite Portland cement plant. And at the very end of that section of the article, it mentions that Yosemite Lead had leased the shipping portion of that building after Yosemite Portland Cement went out of business. That was a clue. What I finally realized or learned is that National Lead was at the very end of the railroad just before you got to El Portal. They shipped out material called barite, and it was very, very heavy, much like lead, and they used it in well drilling of oil wells so that they would put it down the hole, and if they hit a gas pocket, it would keep that gas from exploding and damaging everything. So that plant would process the barite and then bag it and load it into SP, usually boxcars, and ship it into the wherever, Texas, California, had oil wells and so forth. Well, when Yosemite Portland Cement went out of business, the YV knew that they were going to have to abandon. They had lost two of their major shippers, the lumber company and Portland cement. And so National Lead realized that they could not economically ship barite in trucks. You could only ship it in a boxcar and keep the shipping costs low enough to make a profit. So what they did is they worked with the YV and got a couple YV boxcars and shoveled lead into the bottom of these cars, and then took it down to the Yosemite Portland cement plant and bagged it and then shipped it out. And so that is what was going on. So here's a 1944 fan trip photo, and shows a couple of these YV boxcars in the consist, and another shot taken in 44 of another train with a couple of them. So that kind of proved the date on them, and so I was suspecting that. Here's a photo of National Lead, and another photo from a hill nearby looking down at a train that has come in and has dropped off some cars and is ready to pick up cars. If you zoom in on that photo, you can see two YV boxcars there. You can tell they're the YV boxcars because all that white dust. So that meant that those pictures had to be taken after Portland Cement went out of business, which was in 44. So I couldn't model that car with those stains in 1939. Hopefully what I've shared with you today will help you in the future to weather your equipment more realistically and maybe more appropriately. So with that, hope to see you next time.
Uh-oh! I caught that on film. You're ruining your layout. Wow, I can't believe you did that. If I had done that, I would have felt guilty for like 3 weeks.
You better couple them up or somebody will notice. Those things aren't even coupled together.